Okay. Hello everyone, my name is Cameron, and today my topic is going to be climate change. First of all, I want to hope that everybody had a good weekend. Did anybody notice how hot it was this weekend? It was, I know for a fact around here, it was around in the 90s. So that in April, which I think was kind of high, but that brings me to my claim, which is accelerated climate change is a result of human activity. And for those of you that aren't really familiar with the controversy around the topic, basically the other side of this claim would be that some people believe that that climate change is a natural process and that the climate change we're experiencing is the natural pattern and process of our Earth's weather. So basically I want to start off, the National Geographic website defines global warming as the current rise in average temperature of the oceans, temperature, and air. So basically, so with that, I want to address a common misconception. I remember one time I was walking through the field in the fall, and I noticed that there was some frost on the ground, and I heard some people talking about how it was freakishly cold for being in the fall, and that so much for global warming, because if global warming is really happening, why is there frost on the ground and why is it so cold? And one thing I want to address is that climate change refers to the overall warming effect, but that causes the changes in climates, which can be cooler or hotter. And that only emphasizes more that we were seeing a more drastic change in temperature because we were seeing such low temperatures in odd seasons and such high ones in other seasons. So basically my first supporting fact is going to be that climate change is significant and the negative effects of it are impacting all of us. So basically the CO2 emissions are at an all-time high, and according to the Environmental Defense Fund, though natural amounts of CO2 have varied from 180 to 300 parts per million, today's CO2 levels are around 390 parts per million, which is 30% higher than the natural rates that have ever been produced over the last 800,000 years. And basically, the amount of CO2 that's in our atmosphere is basically creating a blanket around the Earth, which is insulating all the heat, thus causing the warming effect that we're experiencing, sometimes colder, as I explained. And what this warming effect can cause, according to NASA, these effects that scientists had predicted in the past would result from climate change are now occurring, such as the loss of sea ice, accelerated rise in sea levels, and more intense and longer heat waves. And these effects are already starting to be felt around the world. NASA also explained that in Africa, as early as by 2020, between 75 and 250 million people are projected to be exposed to increased water stress. Yields from rain-fed agriculture could be reduced by up to 50%, and in some regions, agriculture production, including access to food, may be severely compromised. So 250 million people is quite a lot to be adversely impacted by human activity that's causing these climate changes. Next, I'm going to be talking about the increased consumption of fossil fuels and how that affects the accelerated climate change. The burning of fossil fuels is one of the #1 causes, and according to the EPA, the majority of greenhouse gases comes from burning fossil fuels to produce energy, and deforestation, industrial processes, and some agricultural practice also emit gases into the atmosphere, which are also causing these negative effects. And then the EPA also reiterates those effects as being which can affect water supplies, agriculture, power and transportation systems, the natural environment, and even our own health and safety. So basically, like we were talking about in Africa, in the next 8 or so years, they can have severe droughts and intense heat waves. Next, we'll be talking about the increased population growth and how it contributes, and how that contributes to the overall negative effects of climate change. So basically, according to the United Nations Population Fund, human population grew from 1.6 billion to 6.1 billion during the course of the 20th century. And during that time, emissions of CO2 leading to greenhouse gas grew 12-fold. So basically, within a century, we grew about 5 billion in number, and our emissions of CO2 grew 12 times the rate that they were at before. And our population is continuing to grow, and this is causing an increased consumption of resources. This goes into why we're consuming so many fossil fuels, and which leads into the adverse effects that I mentioned. And then with the increased consumption of our resources, the World Population Balance website also stated that current global population of over 7 billion is already 2 or 3 times the higher sustainable level. Several recent studies show that Earth's resources are enough to sustain only about 2 billion people at the European standard of living. So we're 2 or 3 times the amount that our carrying capacity of our resources can withstand. And by us continuing to consume, we're perpetuating the cycle of climate change and the effects that it has on everybody around the world. So basically in conclusion, just want to mention, or reiterate that the increased consumption of fossil fuels and our constantly growing population size is contributing to these negative effects that climate change has around the world. So, thank you.
All right, Cameron, the proposition is clearly indicated. I thought you did a good job explaining the controversy and why there's a dispute on this. There's no layout of what the secondary points are at the beginning of the speech, so we have to pick them up as you go along. And I think the first couple of points are relatively clear. When you get to the issue about population, that seems to be the final point that you're making there. So we can figure out what the supporting issues are. What the claims are needs to be much more directly stated, that you need to tell us what the inferences are on those individual points. At the end, I think you needed a little bit more summary, although we get the general idea, so I don't think that it's that people will be befuddled, but it's just a question of whether or not the argument would be clear. I do think that there are several places where you're presenting the conclusions of researchers as opposed to the evidence that the researchers used to reach those conclusions, and I think that you need both. There's nothing wrong with presenting the conclusions, but if you're asking us to base it simply on some authority's opinion, then that invites the response from the other side to present a contrary opinion from somebody who's also authoritative, also without any grounds for supporting that particular conclusion. And then it's just, who's got the most degrees kind of comparison, and I'm not sure that that's the best way to resolve the disputes on those types of issues. You did a good job citing the sources and giving qualifications on them for the most part, and I thought you did a very nice job speaking to the audience and presenting the argument in a fairly clear way. I did think, where are you, Andrew, out there? I did think it was a little odd, though, that when you criticize at the beginning, the misconception that people have about the weather, and you talked about given that your introduction talked about the heat, and it seems like you're using the exact same kind of example reasoning to get our attention, that you then come along and say, well, that's a misconception. And I'm going, well, wait a second, didn't you just do the same thing a second ago? And I understand the purpose in doing that, but I think it kind of undermines your credibility a little bit. All right, thank you.